book the detail of how the liberation movements, and here he's focusing specifically on the ANC as really the key movement that drove a lot of the broad umbrella struggle. You can see the detail in this book of how it was that the ANC enabled a culture of internal democracy, an internal political principle that ensured that its struggle was guided by a moral, principled ethos, right? I mean, that's one of the beautiful things, and that's the argument that's being made here about where does the Constitution actually come from in South Africa. And you can see all the archival detail here, but actually it came from Africans themselves. Bopalo Jordan, the thinkers, right? I just want to read, let me just see if I can read. There's a funny thing here on page 87 where they are debating where the capital should be, and it says leave that topic for a time being. So they were debating everything, these people. But let me just read this section from the ANC's Code of Conduct that they adopted in Zambia after they saw their own liberation movement having problems within, right? So they are not just worried about the immorality of apartheid. They are worried if they themselves are immoral while they are running their own struggle. And that is a testament, I always say, to Oliver Tambo. And we'll come back, if ever there are Department of Education officials here, as to why Oliver Tambo is not one of the biggest topics in our history curriculum. But anyway, we'll discuss that another day. And that's not to diminish the likes of Biko, but to say there are forms of very strong leadership that carried this country through, right? So under Oliver Tambo's overarching leadership, these young people sit there, old and young actually, this committee says, and this is what this book is about, just deliberating on, we need to be ahead of our enemy when it comes to having systems of knowing after we are free, how are we going to govern ourselves? We can't be on the back foot because they're going to dictate to us, Labapunu. We must arrive and say, hey, here's the principles we're going to be governing the new South Africa. Nas says, right? Because if you don't, they'll tell you, okay? So this is what happens when they're discussing this issue of their own morality, and I think this is something about how Albie Sachs, who was amongst them, came to think about internal morality. And he said, in fighting for justice in our land, we must ensure at all times that justice exists inside our organization. Our members, the people of South Africa and the people of the world must know and feel that for us, justice is not merely an ideal, but the fundamental principle that governs all our actions. In other words, they could see that if they don't know how to practice democracy from within, even as they were fighting for their liberation, they would never be able to enact democracy after they were free. So that ability to think was some kind of a prophetic thinking, right? If you can't do democracy in your movement, you're not going to do democracy afterwards. And for all the chaos that sometimes is happening with the ANC today, I just want to ask if there's how many African liberation movements are still able to carry on their own internal elections and have outcomes. The ANC, for all its chaos, sometimes that emerges, is still able to carry through its own elections because that culture is deeply embedded in the movement, right? And then they carried that thing through in terms of thinking, how do we ensure that when we are running the country now, all our institutions reflect this culture? And this is the story of how they did that thing, right? So now, one of the questions that I ask myself is, why should black people have accepted elections in 1994 in the way that they did? Why did the whole world think it's a surprise that black people are queuing here in an orderly fashion? And I don't mean black people to isolate. I mean because these people had been oppressed, right? These people had gone through the West. But come 94, hey man, queues, abantu bamile, and they are ready to vote. And alongside them, even their former oppressors are also queuing, waiting to vote. How do you think that was achieved? It wasn't just that, right? It has to do with what's embedded in the way black South Africans conducted their struggle themselves, containing themselves to have principles and discipline, right? And it had to do with that history that Andre spoke about, where black people literally had to consistently remind themselves that what they're fighting for here is not some kind of, what we just want is to redominate everyone. Black South Africans have consistently fought for universal inclusivism, have consistently said what we want is a South Africa for all, in which black people are liberated and free, right? On our ancestral land, we're arguing for everybody to be an equal, right? So that history is powerful because it is not an accident that you see people standing in line patiently saying, no, this is what we were asking for. This is what we were fighting for. Young men and women died in foreign countries, died in hostels, died on our streets because my vote must actually be seen and it must actually count. And that owed to the over 100 years of this discussion, right? That black people had been making this argument for that long, all right? So when I look at that, I look on it with wonder, and I think also about how elections had been used in this country by white supremacists, by the white settler regime, by Amabunu basically, to subvert the lives of Africans, right? This is the story that you write so eloquently in all the books, right? So, and Bamnyama have always known ukuthi Jongan, we are actually Democrats. Our indigenous systems, is a form of democratic consensus. They're consulting each other. They are mixing those traditions, and then they see the white man's system is here. And if you look back on it, it's very profound. It's very profound when you look back on the early ANC, where you have the educated Africans simultaneously recognizing their indigenous leaders in the same place at the same time in 1912. Because they were saying, we recognize our indigenous systems here, and we recognize that we have now been thrown into this modern world by these Britannians and these Boers. We have no choice. They knew it. They knew it. Those early intellectuals knew it. They were able to carry. That's why I think so many of these indigenous leaders, I'm just thinking of the Queen of Swaziland, please remind me, Lapotibeni. That's why they funded these African intellectuals, right? It was the traditional leaders who, we call them traditional leaders. Is there a better term? I'm a cause, and African royals, better. Thank you. The African royals who funded the Democrats, isn't it? They were the ones who supported the new movements because they could see, but you don't escape from the future by pretending the past has not changed. You go into the future by combining and getting ahead. And if you look, this book is exactly that principle carrying forward, right? So so in thinking about all of that, as I sort of move towards culminating my thoughts in response to Andre's book and the conversation you asked me to open, if whites had been in the white regime, had basically made elections look illegitimate, okay? One of the key elections, 1924, JBM Herzog and the Labour Party coming together to bring together Afrikaner working class and English working class against Africans, right? Through those elections. 1948, the election that brought about the last phase of colonization called apartheid, right? Elections had been happening here, but black people stood on one principle, which is that, no, we're going for a non-racial system here, right? So now, if I look at it, I ask myself, so you look at all of that and you think, this is actually profound, since Africans had no reason to be that magnanimous, no reason to be that generous, okay? Africans and black people at large. But there was a level of political insight that they understood, and I think here was the political insight. What you see here when they argue that if we are not moral ourselves, we will not be able to govern ourselves morally in our own freedom. This was borne out every single day in this country when people were undergoing violence from the apartheid regime. But in particular, if you look at the places where violence was happening most intensely, violence in KwaZulu-Natal, you experienced violence just here when the changeover was happening, violence in Johannesburg in the 90s. I think the level of violence that people went through by the time elections come, and then the killing of Chris Hani in 93, by the time the elections come about, black people understood we've completed our mission. So the elections come not as a compromise, but as the high point of we've completed our mission through hell and darkness. All right? Many of you can contest me since you were the ones that were effecting this change. But reading it, it really does read in many ways that way, even though I was, at the time, I was still young watching it. I think, so today now we look and we've got about 25 years of distance from that first election, and what we're seeing more and more is an apathy around voting growing, people choosing not to go to vote, and this happens when people believe that elections don't bring change. And that's not something the IEC can solve. That is something society can solve. Ironically though, the way to solve this problem is to actually promote more voting, so that people understand that your vote actually is as meaningful as your participation, right? And another thing that we've seen, in addition to voter apathy growing, is we see young people calling for violence, right? Young people calling for violence because they believe that they were compromised in the 1990s, that there was a generation yabantu abadala yabathengisa. So young people believe that, in fact, elections is a form of participating in selling out. And we've heard this on and on and on with a lot of, especially the younger male leaders saying elections are basically you are voting to rearrange the plantation. You may think this is far from you. You all send your children to a university. Okay? Your children are all coming to university. They are the ones banning the universities, okay? Just so you know. Your children, the ones you sent to Selborne, when they arrive, bafike babe ngobiko ke pha ekuthi. Yeah? Beni bathumele Selborne besathi ya bro, mabefika pha kum baba ngubiko ke kum. And they become extremely radicalized because they feel, hey man, why does Selborne still exist and why didn't I get to learn my own history, right? So young people are calling for violence because they find that these systems that you fought for and you thought you were doing the great thing, these are ineffective systems. So what we need to do is that we need to assist the young to see reality for what it is. You have to remind them of the past. You have to remind them that they are not the first ones to think. You have to remind them that, in fact, there's a whole history as to how we bring systems about. You've only been able to sustain democracy for 30 years because we thought about how we were going to sustain it. And then we institutionalized that thinking through forms like the IEC. We have to remind them that violence actually begets violence. And I often tell them, do you think when your parents were fighting the struggle and the Boers were able to infiltrate them, that when you are immune to infiltration? And your parents had higher morality than you, they had higher discipline than you, they had higher calling than you to fight apartheid, and they were still infiltrated. Black on black violence, that thing that happened in KZN, third force. You think today you can withstand any of that? That's what I asked them. Whereas they were able to run underground cells and liberate a country, you think the one that went to Selborne, you're gonna call for violence, you think it's gonna be fine? It's not gonna be fine. So I often ask them that. But either way, we have to remind them that therefore the greatest achievement is thinking through the processes and institutionalizing our thinking as guided by our own morality, and that our history is actually foundational for understanding a sort of a better electoral future. Thanks.
Yeah. She's saying when I was 20, ngifuna ukuthi kanti una ngaphi ngoku. Sorry. Thank you very much, Prof. Kize. I am I'm overwhelmed. Really, really, you know, more than anything, I see the synergy between the two speakers who seem to understand each other's work, you know. I think they complement each other very well. I guess this is not the first. This is what you see when mentoring happens. It can happen whether it is designed or not designed. Because when Professor Odedal was speaking here, he said something about these things which or Professor Mkiza will do, because he knows that he is, you know, there are things that he cannot do, but surely people like Dr. Mkiza will make sure that those things do happen. That's what I'm taking from this experience. You have said many things, but let me not make my comments now. But I remember just one point on the subordination of the armed struggle to political leadership. Through exactly, if you've seen a speech by, or was it a complaint, but Christian, when he was complaining how hurt he was when the armed struggle was suspended, without speaking to them as soldiers. But it was something that was decided high up there to suspend the armed struggle when they had come back, just come back from exile. So I see what you're saying there. Let me call our next and last speaker, last but not least. The next speaker, for those who do not know him, is Mr. Sheburi, who is a DCO at IEC, DCO Electoral Operations, Las Calacon. He started off, well, brief history with him, because he is a child of the commission. He's a child of the commission. I know somewhat about what he did, he used to do before he came to join the commission, but I will leave that for him to share with us. But I know that he started off as a manager, electoral operations. I often warn you, and he went on to become the PEO of Gauteng. He is now the CEO, Electoral Operations. Dipimna. Diapimna. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Prof. Odendal and Prof. Mkize. Pio, thank you for convening us in this citadel of thought in the month of September. And our gathering here in September must serve as a vivid reminder, if ever we needed any, of what happens when a group of people take it upon themselves to even annul the biblical injunction that all men are created equal and in the image of God. It is apt that we also deal with constitutionalism and election in the era of cancel culture, where thought is relegated to sound bites of the echo chamber, which is social media. We are challenged today to assimilate new knowledge, to discard that with which we knew. And there's nothing as said as a person who, confronted with knowledge, refuses or they are incapable to assimilate that knowledge, and they persist as though cognitive dissonance was a good thing to do. I want to talk about two things. The evolution of democracy, the Prof has dealt with it. I just want to reinforce a few things. Secondly, talk about the more contemporaneous issues in the field of elections and the work that we are doing. Today, the Portfolio Committee on Home Affairs was considering the amendments to the Electoral Amendment Scheme to accommodate independence. That is a continuation in a journey of elections in the country. But before I do that, I just wish to touch on a few things. The first one is to suggest that the democratic breakthrough in 1994 bequeathed to South Africa and her people a promissory note in the form of a constitution. So when people say Ziyakhala manje, it means people are going to cash in that promise of the constitution. And if the promise in the constitution do not find resonance with the lived experiences of people, it creates a state of anomy where you have a good constitution on paper that is never translated into anything tangible in the lived experiences of people. But it doesn't mean that we must repudiate the constitution as though it was an imposition. The Prof has dealt with the evolution of that. For purposes of our work, there are few key promises that we as an institution must make sure that we realize. One is a promise which was codified in the Freedom Charter but predates the days of the Freedom Charter. It's a promise, and this is in the founding provision, that South Africa is a democracy based on adult universal suffrage. In other words, franchise is not qualified. You do not vote because you own property. You do not vote because you have a positive balance. You vote because you are a citizen and you have attained the age of majority. So this is what we must ensure, that in our outreach, in our education drives, we are equitable. We do not worsen cleavages in society, but our efforts are intended to ameliorate and bridge those societal divide. The second is that our democracy is premised on a national common voters' roll. We come from the era of tricameral parliaments, we come from an era of qualified franchise. The promise in the Constitution is that you vote on the basis of a common voters' roll, not a voters' roll for any specific class of persons, not a reservation of a veto right for a specific class of people. So in other words, for a person to be registered on the voters' roll, they don't have to meet any form of special criteria, other than that they are a citizen and they've attained the age of majority. For UCA, I dare even suggest that while the court has elevated an address to a condition almost precedent to a free and fair election, the founders and drafters of the Constitution accepted that our developmental past is such that you cannot insist on proof of address for the exercise of an important right as the right to franchise. Other than that, it would mean that all those people who are not ratepayers would not be on the common voters' roll, or they would be regarded as second-class citizens in the country of their birth. Professor Mkhize dealt with the regularity of elections and multi-party system of government, not because the Constitution creates a preserve of participation only for parties, but only as a way to say ours is a multi-party system of democracy, to denounce a one-party state. The Bill of Rights, as we all know, forms the cornerstone of our democratic edifice, and it also gives guarantees to South Africans. It guarantees political rights, which include the right to form a political party, to campaign for a political cause, but more importantly, the right for all adult citizens to stand for elections and, if elected, to hold political office. The scheme in the Constitution aggregates to create a never again impulse, to say we draw the line in the sand and will never go back to those undemocratic practices of qualified franchise, of freedom for some, and subjudication for the rest. The electoral system, as we all know, is a fancy word just for saying how votes are cast and how those cast votes are translated into representation in legislative assemblies. And this we find in section 46D and 105D of the Constitution, which says elections in the country must result in general proportionality. The drafters were alive that you can never attain pure proportionality. And proportionality simply means that your seats that you hold in a legislative assembly must resemble the proportion of the vote or support that you enjoy as a political party or political formation. Why am I talking about this? It's because after the democratic breakthrough, the country opted for a system of proportional representation. It is not a perfect system. None of the electoral systems are perfect. But it was a system chosen to serve a historical purpose of our time. The strength of a PR system are the following. One, it translates votes into seats in the manner that leads to inclusive assemblies. If you recall, you had the far right wing just before the transition, who threatened not to participate in the election and to disrupt the electoral course. But because we use a PR system, it ensures to a greater degree that every voice has representation in the House. It's easier for people to be in the tent and peace inside than to stand outside and peace inside of the tent. So it makes people feel that they have representation and their voice are heard in the legislative chambers. It minimizes the phenomenon of wasted votes because the votes, especially in our system where we do not have a threshold, in other words, there are jurisdictions where a party must meet a certain support in order to receive a seat. In South Africa, we do not have a threshold. So all the votes cast aggregate to get a party something in the Legislative Assembly. Let's take, for example, before the DA started scoring own goals, the Freedom Front Plus was guaranteed voice in most of the legislatures, not because they have enough support to win a seat, but because of the fractions of those seats, they aggregate that votes and they receive representation. If we had a threshold, they would not have representation in any of the provincial legislatures. But more importantly for the country in transition like ours, the PR system has the potential of forcing strongman parties or regional parties or ethnic-based parties to want to cooperate or even reach out to people other than their strong base, because it rewards, the more you aggregate votes, it rewards you with seats. So it has the potential theoretically to break parties that have primordial identities, either of ethnic or geographic basis. As with any system, the PR system has its own disadvantages. Key among those is that it does not yield strong majorities, and it forces coalitions to be formed, especially in the country where there's no framework to regulate coalitions, where a party with 48% of the vote can be overlooked in forming coalition, and you find the coalition of the desperate, which by their nature become very tenuous because they are not grounded on any form of ideological coalescence or anything. Another advantage is that it may, and this is clear in most municipalities, it shows the phenomenon where an insignificant voice is elevated because they are kingmakers, because they can vote with a bloc, and therefore small parties and small voices have disproportionate voice in legislative assemblies. And perhaps the biggest criticism for a PR system is that it does not engender accountability, because there is no clear link between a constituency or geographic area and a person that represents those things. But that is not the function of an electoral system. It can contribute, but it can't guarantee that people are accountable. Let's take the system of local government. We have wards. Theoretically, it must lead to more accountability because a person is elected to represent a certain geographic area and they are elected by name, they are known to the community. Whether that translates into accountability still remains to be seen. Let me move and deal with a more topical issue as I prepared to sit down. We all know that in 2020, the Constitutional Court ordered Parliament to change the Electoral Act. Why? Because a group of applicants went to court in what the case is now known as the New Nation Movement to argue basically two things. One, that the Electoral Act as it stood offended the guaranteed political right in Section 19 because it did not facilitate for the participation of independents in the Legislative Assembly other than through the platform of political parties. In other words, an adult citizen could only stand for election if they belonged to a political party and their name appeared on a party list. The secondary argument was that it offends the constitutional scheme because it forces adult citizens to associate when they do not want to associate. In the majority judgment of the Concord penned by Madlanga J, he says the right to association can be asserted in both the positive and the negative. The positive is well-founded, a right to form a party, a right to belong to a union and those type of things. But he says constitutionally, that right can also be asserted in the negative and it is also equally worthy of protection, where people opt out of associations and do not want to associate. So on that basis, the court held that the Electoral Act was unconstitutional to the extent that it forces adult citizens to contest election only through platforms of political parties. What the court did not order, and I think this is important to understand so that you understand the current discourse that is underway in the country. The court did not order a direct election of a president. So in other words, elections, you're still contesting for a seat in a legislative assembly. The law has not changed to facilitate direct election of a president or even a premier. Secondly, the court did not direct Parliament on a specific electoral system. It left that to Parliament, correctly so, because Parliament, as a representative of the people, must make those policy pronouncements. The court also did not elevate any of the principles that underpin electoral scheme design. It did not say the amendments will be unconstitutional if they do not introduce constituencies. It never said the amendments will be unconstitutional if they do not address questions of accountability. The court also did not say what percentage or threshold of seats in the National Assembly must be reserved for contest by independents. In short, the bill before Parliament provides for the following. It retains the 400 seats in the legislature. It splits them as they've always been split, 200, to restore proportionality, and the other 200 to be contested in regions, what we periqually refer to as the regional to national elections. So the first 200 seats are distributed across the regions on the basis of the size of the voters' roll. The more densely populated provinces will have a higher share of those 200 seats. So in those seats, independents can contest. So they contest for a seat in the National Assembly via a region. Because the elections are for a seat in the National Assembly, an independent may contest multiple regions. But if they win more than one seat, they are locked into a single seat because as an independent, you may only occupy a single seat. You can't become independent number 2 and occupy another seat. The votes in excess of the seat are wasted. For example, if you are popular and you stand for election in the Eastern Cape, if the quota for a seat in the Eastern Cape is 30,000 votes, you are popular, you get 100,000 votes. Your first 30,000 votes gives you a seat. And because constitutionally that has yielded the purpose for which you stood, the 70,000 seats in excess of the vote are regarded as wasted vote. They are disregarded. The phenomenon is not only unique to independents. Political parties also lose seats that do not aggregate to give them a seat, whether in the first allocation or as a remainder in the highest, in the ranking of remainders. The bill requires, and this is a more contentious issue, the bill requires independent candidates to demonstrate support. And currently they've placed that as 30% of a quota in a previously comparable election. What does that mean? If you needed 30,000 votes to get a seat in the provincial legislature in Eastern Cape in 2019, so you need to demonstrate that you have the support of 30% of 33,000 to be an independent candidate. And because there is an issue with our politics, and I'm using my words guardedly, not because there are issues with the Constitution or democracy as a form of arranging public affairs, but because there's an issue and deficit in our body politic. Interested groupings and people want to use the electoral system almost as a panacea to cure all the ills of society. We know already now that there are groupings that have threatened to challenge the electoral system to the extent that it does not meet the expectation. We've always understood, and that's the basis on which we've advised Parliament to say, we are agnostic on the electoral system. All that we need to do is that we can help Parliament to perfect the policy choices that it has made. We are not involved in the drafting of the bill. Our involvement only started once Parliament took specific policy decisions. So we've either helped them to refine those or to jettison them to the extent that they were going to create difficulties, not for contestants, but difficulties for the voter, because it's about time that our politics must place the voter at the center of development and discourse in the country. By way of closing remarks, true to the concept of separation of powers, the right to franchise in the country has evolved over time. You'll recall, Kaya, when you first arrived at the IEC, prisoners could not vote. Since the Negro Court order, the right to vote also extends to guests of the president. They vote in national and provincial elections. See, when you were responsible for logistics, you did not send ballots overseas for expatriates overseas. Now South Africans abroad can vote in national and provincial elections. But I suppose more importantly is our ability for us to make sure that ours is truly universal franchise and common on the basis of the common voters role, because we invest significant resources in reaching out to people who would not ordinarily be able to vote. Persons who are living with advanced age, who are infirm, or who are disabled, who are unable to attend on voting day to a voting station. At great resources, we extend special votes to those category of persons. We visit them in their areas or places of confinement to extend the right to vote even to them, to say in unequivocal terms to them that they are citizens and their vote matter in spite of their circumstances in society. And thereby we affirm the badge of personhood as it was described by Justice Albisaks in one of the seminal judgments of the Electoral Court in dealing with the rights to vote. So follow the debates in the Electoral Amendment Act. Whatever happens, 2024 will be a totally new thing. For my colleagues in the IEC, it creates a unique opportunity to unlearn. It creates new opportunity to learn new things. Thank you very much. Thank you to the two profs. Thank you very much.
Dr. Okay. And the neck. But I want to make my comment on, thank you very much, DCO. Thank you very much, sir, for sharing this. I deliberately avoided that question. UPO tried to get me to explain the bill thing during Promanco. Because of its complexities, DCO. I know that my colleagues here have many, that is colleagues at IEC have got many questions, but if we understand it by saying, there is law that is being amended and it's going to be finalized and it will be given to us for us to operationalize. Of course, it is not difficult not to be curious and not want answers. I know in particular DCO about the issue of a proof of address. Uzavuma Dr. Mbali ukuthi yemdlana kutheni bangavele bakhuphe proof of residence abantu. Siyeke ukuthetha. But it's not as simple as that, because once you, as the DCO has said, once you insist on that, then you are offending on other people's rights who will not have a proof of residence because they live under the bridge and so on, or they live in informal settlements. Now time has come